Okay, well, first of all, heads up, some of you want to know where I'm headed next, and that is going to be this book by Mackenzie Wark, Capital is Dead, Is This Something Worse? I want to read this. It's brand new. I want to read it because Wark is trying to find a way beyond the binary that we're trapped in at the moment, capitalism or communism, capitalism or socialism. I also wanted to alert you to an article that goes along with what we're talking about right now, Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. It's an article in Commonweal called Strange Gods, Idolatry in the 21st Century. This author, William Cavanaugh, brings in authors as diverse as Karl Marx, Charles Taylor, Naomi Klein, and so brings a lot of ideas together in a language that is easy to understand. Also, of course, brings in the Bible, so it resonates very much with what we're discussing right now. So I wanted to get back into Brueggemann's ideas, first concerning the position of the prophet. And this is, again, writ large. He's talking about anybody who is trying to bring knowledge of the real situation into the world. And he basically says that, Jeremiah epitomizes this position, but this is the position of the pastor, for instance, who is not full of cheery psychobabble anymore, but actually wants to tell people how troubling things have become. It definitely represents Walter Brueggemann himself and what he's trying to do in this book. The prophet, he says, cuts through royal consciousness. That's the consciousness of the wealthy and powerful, the people in charge. Cuts through that royal consciousness with real anger, grief, and mourning. When people can imagine and see death, he says, royal power is broken. So it may seem like a weakness of sorts to be in mourning, to be angry, to be grieving about how broken the world is or how broken our lives are. And how impossible it seems to fix or change anything. But Brueggemann argues that this is the first step, the first and necessary step in departing from the pseudo-reality that we have accepted as reality. Until there's grieving and a letting loose of feeling, there can be no true healing and beginning of something new. So he says of the prophet Jeremiah's situation, no one would listen and no one would see what was so transparent to him. So his grief was kept sharp and painful because he had to face regularly the royal consciousness, which insisted peace, peace, when apparently only he knew there was no peace. And that gets us into a very important theme in this book, which is that people are living in that royal consciousness, that false reality, that the people in power want us to believe. Brueggemann argues that they very much want us to believe that things are all fine and that things will always go on as they have, whatever that means. The dream of what it is that we have, maybe a stable life, a long life, prosperity, all of those things, which are either non-existent or are very fragile and superficial and ephemeral. Brueggemann says, what I propose is this: the royal consciousness leads people to numbness, especially numbness about death. This is a very profound point for him. People in a royal society are encouraged not to think about death. Not just the fact that we will ourselves die, but that death is all around us. He says we live in a world where death is so visible, so daily, so pervasive, and so massive, and yet so unnoticed. I mean, if you turn on the news, which I would encourage you not to do, the 24-hour news anyway, you will notice that it's death, death, death all day long, but it seems very remote and distant, right? But also death is right in front of us, but we choose not to see it. Death is in front of us in the way that we choose to live, the things that we choose to put into our body, the way that we treat our bodies, the way that we treat others and encourage others to live in ways that aren't healthy and that aren't life-affirming and don't make people ultimately happy. So death, again, writ large, in the larger sense, truly pervades our entire lives. And yet we are encouraged, he argues, to believe that we will live forever, that things will always be the same. He says the king would have it be like a casino in Las Vegas, where there is no clock and no time, no beginning and no end, no time to speak or to answer, but only an enduring and unchanging now. So if you've ever been to Vegas, you know you don't know what time it is, and like a whole day could go by with you gaming and not sleeping. And that's the way they want it, because they want to keep you there as long as possible. And so he's likening our life as a whole to the casino. And we are encouraged to think of a future in which everything will remain the same or will be better, and therefore to keep consuming and to keep living in a way that will perpetuate the well-being of those who ultimately benefit from all that consuming. There's a picture of a woman in couture wedding garb, and many of you have probably been to a very, very fancy and expensive wedding, right? Those types of celebrations that are grossly materialistic kind of exemplify what Brueggemann thinks is wrong with our world. And he puts it again in terms of false eternity and ignoring of death. He says we must practice the royal game with our marriages and all our serious relations, with our bodies, our age, our health, our nerve, and our commitments. Just think in terms of marriages. How many of them either are bad or break up? And the fact that we continue to embrace this mythology in which the marriage to a person is supposed to bring about total happiness and the resolution of all of our issues and problems, that this other person and the bond of marriage will last forever and always be good for us and always be there for us. We are encouraged to think this about marriage through everything that we're fed in the media. I mean, just look in the grocery store at the magazines devoted to weddings and how much of it's about what people wear and what they're going to do on their honeymoon, and, you know, the 10 tips for a great relationship. And, you know, there's this promise that all of our problems will be solved. Well, you know, if we have our eyes open, the truth is that such a relationship can never solve all of our problems, and it really shouldn't be about that. That marriage is a fragile thing that one should be very careful about going into, and should not place a lot of weight on, not too much weight, so much weight that it will break, so many expectations, many of them materialistic, about, you know, how much money you're going to make together, what kind of house you're going to get, what your kids are going to be like and what they're going to do, and so on and so forth. With our bodies, you know, we live in this trap of thinking that we can stay young forever, and of spending an inordinate amount of time and money trying to talk ourselves into thinking that we aren't all each getting older every single day, is another way of denying the reality of death. And the economy thrives on that. He says, ultimately, we are incapable of facing our own death. It is the business of kings to attach the word forever to everything we treasure, instead of seeing it as fragile and something to be enjoyed and appreciated in the moment. We work very, very hard and spend a lot of money trying to make sure this fantasy continues on forever as we envision and imagine it now. All right, so back to the theme of the strong narrative, Brueggemann argues that we, at this point in time, do not have strong symbols that are deep or strong enough to match the, quote, terror of reality. That life is very precarious, that bad things happen, can happen, will happen, that death is ever present, and it cannot be staved off. The task of the prophet, he says, is to reactivate out of our historical past symbols that always have been vehicles for redemptive honesty. So we have to not go back to psychobabble, but he argues, have to go back to the culture's deep narrative, which has the strength and the time-tested ability to help us process these truths. And there you have a medieval painting of the parting of the Red Sea by Moses. This whole Moses narrative is a huge part of that for Brueggemann, as you know. Slavery and the freeing from slavery and death. So he then turns to the figure of Jesus, and Brueggemann's Jesus, the way that Brueggemann sees Jesus is very informative. He reminds us that from the beginning, from his birth into the world, Jesus was a known threat to the existing powers, and that's shown in the original story of Jesus's birth. When Herod finds out that a new king has been born, he goes and tries to kill him by attempting to kill every firstborn male child. And so thousands are killed, but Jesus and his family escape. He comes from a marginal outpost, Nazareth. So the emphasis there is on the fact that he does not come from the heights of power, from great wealth, from great education, and all of these things that people have forever put a great deal of weight in and respect in. He came from this lowly place. People thought, well, how could he be a Messiah? Because he came from nowhere, as a matter of fact. He announces another kingdom. This is a threat, again, to the powers that be. He says his kingdom is not of this world, but it's coming into this world. And it is doing things very, very differently. So in every way, he contradicts the status quo and the ideas of what we're supposed to admire. He favors the poor throughout the Gospels, the outcasts, the diseased, the unpopular, the lacking in status. He condemns the religious people who are too worldly, who think in terms of wealth and money and power, and who use their religious authority to rule over others for their own benefit. He calls out the misuse of legalism, the idea that you can manipulate the law and use the law to control people. It's not so much that there should be no law, Brueggemann says, but rather that the priests and people in power will use the law and do that to manipulate and to dominate others. And this is why he continually breaks the law. He teaches that self-righteousness is a major error, really a grave sin, that those who go about very publicly proclaiming that they are right about everything and that others are wrong, they have a problem. And he addresses that a lot in the Gospels. And in his death, Brueggemann says, he shows absolutely, as with his life, that he has solidarity with us in the worst possible moments of our life. And in dying in this way, Brueggemann argues, he shows that life comes only after grieving and death. Of course, in the story of Jesus, that's literally the resurrection, but also the narrative of Jesus's death and resurrection shows the path that the whole world takes. You know, when you think about it, the plant and animal kingdom show this to us all the time, that with death comes new fertility and rebirth. And so in this, Jesus' life and death is showing that first one has to grieve and one has to lose, and in this case lose everything, lose life, or a certain definition of life, right? Brueggemann's message is the life to lose is the life that royal consciousness sells you. And the life to gain is one in which we are free to do the right thing and to live freely on our own terms, and of course in relationship with God, according to this perspective. So I'm going to spend one more week on Brueggemann, and then I will launch into Mackenzie Wark. Capital is Dead. Is This Something Worse? So if you want to get that book, I think it's published by Verso, I believe, and Verso will sell you an e-copy for very little.